In this presentation, we're going to be talking about, or I don't know why I keep saying we, I'm going to be talking about the movement west, who moved, how did they move, and what it was like once they got there. So following the peaceful acquisition of Oregon and the more violent acquisition of California, the migration of Americans to these lands began to increase. The arid area between the Mississippi Valley and the Pacific coast was popularly known in the 1850s and 60s as the Great American Desert. Emigrants passed quickly over this vast dry region to reach the more inviting lands on the west coast. Therefore, California and Oregon were settled by Americans several decades before people attempted to farm the Great Plains. So one of the American history icons is that of the mountain man, the fur trader. And fur traders were the earliest non-native individuals to open or settle the far west. That's that phrase, open and closed, open the frontier and closed frontier, is going to be something that you're going to continue to hear in this class. So to open it is to settle. In the 1820s, they had yearly get-togethers or meetings called rendezvous in the Rockies with American Indians to trade for animal skins and also to socialize and catch up on other mountain men gossip. Men like James Beckworth, Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, and Jedediah Smith were among the hardy band of explorers and trappers who provided much of the early information about trails and frontier conditions to later settlers. Pictured here is Jedediah Smith, who survived in his lifetime. It's very interesting. In his lifetime, he survived 3 massacres and a bear attack. So here is this reenactment of a bear attack. After the mountain men, a much larger group of pioneers made the hazardous journey west in hopes of clearing the forests and farming the fertile valleys of California and Oregon. Pictured here are the 3 most common trails and ways that people crossed into the west. You'll see in purple the Mormon Trail, which left from Illinois and ended in Salt Lake City, Utah, of course. The Oregon Trail is pictured in red, left from Independence, Missouri, and ended in Oregon City, Oregon. And the Santa Fe Trail, pictured in green, also left from Missouri and ended where? Why, Santa Fe, of course. In 1860, hundreds of thousands had reached their westward goal by following these trails. The long, arduous trek usually began in St. Joseph or Independence, Missouri, or in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and followed the river valleys through the Great Plains. Inching along at only 15 miles a day, a wagon train needed months to finally reach the foothills of the Rockies or face the hardships of the southwestern deserts. The final life or death challenge was to get through the mountain passes of the Sierras and the Cascades before the first heavy snow, when they were no longer passable. If you want an interesting side story on that, look up the Donner Party. While pioneers feared attacks by American Indians, the most common and serious dangers were disease, like dysentery, and depression, really, from the harsh everyday conditions on the trail. Can you imagine walking, I mean, look at that. Can you imagine walking across the United States? No, I have a hard enough time convincing myself to walk to the store that is literally right across the street from me. All right, so another American icon is that of the miners, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but let's talk about the mining frontier first. So in 1848, a man by the name of John Sutter found gold in his mill, and this is the official start of the American gold rush, and it set off many migrations to mineral-rich mountains of the West. Gold or silver rushes occurred in Colorado, Nevada, the Black Hills of the Dakotas, and other western territories. The mining boom brought tens of thousands of men, and later women, but at first it was mainly men, into the western mountains. Mining camps and towns, which were mainly short-lived, sprang up wherever a strike or a discovery was reported. Largely as a result of the gold rush, California's population soared from a mere 14,000 in 1848 to 380,000 in 1860. Booms attracted miners from all around the world, and by the 1860s, almost a third of the miners in the West were Chinese. So here's this icon of American history in the mining frontier, and it's that of the prospector. Prospectors were men who set out into the American West, braving certain danger in order to strike it rich. They lived in tents and in mining towns and were beholden to none. And we can see the popularity of this icon of the prospector. It's even in Disney characters. Here's the character titled Prospector from Toy Story. But in reality, few prospectors actually struck it rich. The most profitable mining was done by those who could afford to mine on a much larger scale. Here's a picture of workers using hydraulic mining. This tactic shot water out of a hose, loosing the mountainsides, where sediment would then roll off into nearby streams and man-made ditches, which employees could then sift. Because the water was powered by burning coal or wood, the gold rush also fueled the lumber industry. But one of the biggest impacts also that mining had was on the environment. Mining led to an increase in sediment from the mountainside entering nearby streams and waterways. And it's not so much the dirt and sediment of the rock that posed a problem, though that did pose a problem of stopping up waterways and whatnot. But the bigger lasting impact are the minerals and the pollutants that escape from the mountain. Toxins such as mercury, arsenic, and cyanide continue to this day to seep into the environment, prompting California officials to urge others not to eat fish caught from certain areas of water. And this is a present-day issue. Here in this picture, you can see the Malakoff mine, which is one of the largest, if not, I think, the largest mine in the world. That mountainside was completely cleared by hydraulic mining that you see there. Most pioneer families moved west to start homesteads and begin farming. Congress's Preemption Acts of 1830 and 40s gave squatters, and remember squatters are people who are living on the land without a legal claim, so it gave squatters the right to settle public lands and purchase them for low prices once the government put them up for sale. In addition, the government made it easier for settlers by offering parcels of land as small as 40 acres for sale. However, moving west was not for the penniless. A family needed at least $200 to $300 to make the overland trip, which was a considerable amount at the time, and eliminated as such many of the poor from this opportunity. The trek to California and Oregon was largely a middle-class movement. And here are some two pictures that I absolutely adore for highlighting life on the American frontier for homesteaders. And the isolation of pioneers was especially difficult during the first few years because nobody was there and there was nothing there. Eventually, rural communities slowly begin to develop, and the institutions that these people established, like schools or churches or clubs and later political parties, were modeled, not surprisingly, after those they had known in the East. or for immigrants from abroad, from their native lands. So these are some iconic photographs of homesteaders. And these photos kind of predate the antebellum era, but there's a little bit of overlap, as we'll talk about later. But I thought I'd throw them in there because they do highlight the isolation and difficulties, but also the pride and the hard work of homesteaders. In that upper right-hand corner, you can see a family sitting or standing for their picture to be taken in front of their mud brick house, which they, of course, have built themselves. It's a pretty fancy house. It has a window there. I wonder who that other chair is for. And then the bottom is absolutely my favorite picture. Look at, first of all, the openness of that field is pretty amazing. You have these two ladies, or a little girl and a lady, and this lady is hauling a wheelbarrow. What do you think is in that wheelbarrow? If you said poop, then you are correct. Yep, there is no available wood in the area. Look at those two pictures. There's really nothing there. Okay, so burning poop was an excellent source of fire and fuel. Okay, the era of territorial expansion coincided with a period of remarkable economic growth from the 1840s to 1857. Before 1840, factory production had been concentrated mainly in the textile mills of New England. But after 1840, industrialization spread rapidly to other states of the Northeast. The new factories produced shoes, sewing machines, ready-to-wear clothing, firearms, precision tools, and iron products for railroads and other technologies. The invention of the sewing machine by Elias Howe took much of the production of clothing out of the homes and into factories. An electric telegraph, successfully demonstrated in 1844 by its inventor, Samuel F.B. Morse, went hand in hand with the growth of the railroads in enormously speeding up communication and transportation across the country. The canal building era of the 1820s and 30s was replaced in the next 2 decades with the rapid expansion of rail lines, especially across the Northeast and Midwest. The railroads soon emerged as America's largest industry, and I cannot stress enough how important they were. As such, they required immense amounts of capital and labor and gave rise to complex business organizations. Local merchants and farmers would often buy stocks or pieces of a company in new railroad companies in order to connect their area to the outside world. Local and state governments granted 2.6 million acres of federal land to build the Illinois Central Railroad from Lake Michigan to the Gulf of Mexico. The first, but certainly not the last, federal land grant of its time. So these were railroads were subsidized by government, but they were private industries, a concept that is going to cause a bunch of controversy or problems, at least later. Cheap and rapid transportation particularly promoted Western agriculture. Farmers in Illinois and Iowa were now more closely linked to the Northeast by rail than by river routes to the South. The railroads not only united the common commercial interest of the Northeast and the Midwest, but would also, spoiler alert, give the North strategic advantages in the Civil War. The growth of manufactured goods, as well as in agricultural products, both Western grains and Southern cotton, caused a large growth of exports and imports. Other factors also played a role in the expansion of the U.S. trade in the mid-1800s. Shipping firms encouraged trade and travel across the Atlantic by having their sailing packets depart on a regular schedule, rather than unscheduled departures that had been the normal practice in the 18th century. The demand for whale oil to light the homes of the middle class Americans caused a whaling boom between the 1830s and 60s. Improvements in the design of ships came in time to speed gold seekers on their journey to the California gold fields. The development of the American clipper ship cut the 5 to 6 month trip from New York to the Horn of South America to San Francisco to as little as 89 days. Steamships also took the place of clipper ships in the mid-1850s because they had greater storage capacity, could be maintained at a lower cost, and could more easily follow a regular schedule. And last but not least, the federal government expanded U.S. trade by sending Commodore Matthew C. Perry to Japan to force them to open its ports to trade with Americans. In 1854, Perry made Japan's government sign a treaty that opened Japanese ports to U.S. trading vessels. So that it helped expand trade because the United States now has another new market that is available to them. But all of this was not to last. The mid-century economic boom ended in 1857 with another financial panic. Prices, especially from Midwestern farmers, dropped sharply, and unemployment in northern cities increased. Since cotton prices remained high, though, the South was less affected. And as a result, some Southerners believed that their plantation economy was far superior than the and they believed that continued union with the Northern economy wasn't really needed. So the Panic of 1857, while it caused havoc in the North and the Midwest, actually made the Southern region think, hey, we don't really need to be a part of the Union. And that's significant because not 3 years later, they're basically, some states are going to basically act on that belief. Western cities that rose as a result of the railroad, mineral wealth, and farming attracted a number of professionals and business owners. For example, San Francisco and Denver became instant cities created by the gold and silver rushes. Salt Lake City grew because it offered fresh supplies to travelers on the overland trails for the balance of their westward journey. So now that I've shown you some of the basic elements of this unit, I also want to spend a bit of time talking about how this time period has been represented. This, how history has been written over time, is known as historiography, and it's basically the bread and butter of historians. When historians write, they're making an argument. They're not just stating a list of facts. And there are some basic agreements, but by and large, people's contributions, causes and effects of events or inventions, and legacies are all And legacies are all ground, there we are. Sorry, guys. Okay, so people's contributions, causes and effects of events or inventions, and legacies are all grounds for discussion in history. This sometimes freaks people out because up until now, most of what you have learned has been presented in kind of a one-size-fits-all, no debates mentioned textbook. But that's not how we approach history in this class. Like any source, we want to understand the perspective of the author. And so here are some of the common perspectives on manifest destiny and westward expansion. Traditionalist traditional historians stress the accomplishments of westward expansion by bringing civilization and democratic institutions to a wild area. The heroic efforts of mountain men and pioneering families to overcome a hostile environment have long been celebrated by both historians and popular media, right? As evidenced by my reference to American icons. As a result, though, of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, historians became more aware of racist language and beliefs. They recognized the racial undercurrents in the political speeches of the 1840s that argued for expansion in American Indian, Mexican, and Central American territories. Some historians argue that racist motives might even have promoted the decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Mexico instead of occupying it. They point out that Americans who opposed the idea of making Mexico resorted to racist arguments, asserting that it would be undesirable to incorporate large non-Anglo populations into the Republic. Recent historians have also broadened their research into westward movement. Rather than concentrating on the achievement of Anglo pioneers, they've focused more on these topics, like the impact of American Indians when their land was taken, the influence of Mexican culture on U.S. culture, the contributions of African American and Asian American pioneers, and the role of women in the development of Western family and community life. Mexican historians take a different point of view on the events of the 1840s. As they point out, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo took half of Mexico's territory, and they argued that the War of 1846 gave rise to a number of long-standing economic and political problems that continue to plague Mexico's development as a modern nation. From another perspective, the war with Mexico, and especially the taking of California, were motivated by imperialism, the desire to establish an empire, rather than racism. Historians taking this position argue that the U.S. was chiefly interested in trade with China and Japan and needed California as a base for U.S. commercial ambitions in the Pacific. U.S. policymakers were afraid that California would fall into the hands of Great Britain or some other European power if the United States didn't move first. And that, my friends, is the end of this segment.